What would you do if the house you just bought had a door that wasn't on any blueprint ever drawn? Margaret Dawson, a 46-year-old auto mechanic from Bedford, Indiana, thought she was simply purchasing a rundown farmhouse at a county auction. What she discovered instead was a hidden door concealed behind a pantry wall, and behind that door, something that would drain the color from her face and freeze the blood in her veins. Something buried for nearly a century, waiting in the darkness for the right person to find it. This is not merely another home renovation story. This is a tale of secrets that refuse to stay buried, of a family learning to trust each other again, and of one woman who refused to let anyone take what she had fought so hard to build. Stay with us, because what happens next will leave you speechless. The morning of December 3rd began like any other for Maggie Dawson, with grease under her fingernails and a knot of worry in her stomach. She stood in the service bay of Dawson's Auto Repair, her father's shop that she had inherited 12 years ago after pancreatic cancer took him in 6 weeks flat. The space smelled of motor oil and cold metal, the familiar perfume of honest work that had defined her entire adult life. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the concrete floor where a 2019 Honda Accord sat with its hood raised like a patient waiting for surgery. Outside the garage doors, the first snowflakes of December drifted down from a pewter sky, catching the weak morning light before disappearing into the frozen ground. In her hands, Maggie held a letter from First Indiana Trust that had arrived in yesterday's mail. The words blurred and sharpened as she read them for the fourth time, each pass making the message no less devastating. Notice of default. Accelerated payment required. Foreclosure proceedings will commence in 60 days unless the outstanding balance of $47,000 is satisfied in full. Her ex-husband's name appeared nowhere on the document, though his ghost haunted every line. Dennis Dawson had vanished 3 years ago with his 24-year-old secretary, leaving behind a mountain of debt he had hidden through a Byzantine network of credit cards and personal loans, all of them secured against the shop Maggie had poured her soul into for nearly 2 decades. She folded the letter carefully, creasing the edges with the precision of someone who understood that falling apart was not an option. The shop was cold this morning because she had turned the heat down to save money, and her breath fogged in the air as she tucked the envelope into the back pocket of her worn Carhartt overalls. $47,000. She might as well have owed $47 million. The shop brought in enough to cover payroll for her one part-time employee, utilities, parts suppliers, and the mortgage on the cramped 2-bedroom apartment where she and her children had retreated after Dennis cleaned out their savings account on his way out the door. There was nothing left over for emergencies, and certainly nothing for a debt she hadn't known existed until the certified letter arrived. The phone on the wall rang and Maggie crossed the shop to answer it, wiping her hands on a rag that had seen better days. Her sister Karen's voice crackled through the receiver, carrying the particular tone of false concern that Karen had perfected over 4 decades of sibling rivalry. Maggie listened as her sister rattled on about some property auction happening at the county courthouse that morning. Something about a farmhouse nobody wanted. A place so run down that the starting bid had dropped to $15,000 after 3 failed attempts to sell it. Karen laughed about how perfect it would be for Maggie, how fitting that she would end up in a haunted wreck now that her life had become one. Maggie said nothing, letting her sister's words wash over her like cold water, waiting for the call to end so she could return to the only thing that had never let her down: work. But something snagged in her mind as she hung up the phone. $15,000. She had that much, barely, tucked away in an account Dennis had never discovered. Money she had been saving since Sophie was born, in case everything fell apart. The account represented 12 years of birthday checks from her late mother, small deposits made whenever she had an extra $20, a secret cushion against the disaster she had always sensed was coming. The shop was lost either way. In 60 days, First Indiana Trust would take everything her father had built, everything she had maintained and grown and loved. But a house, even a broken one, was something they could not touch. A place that belonged to her and her children alone, free and clear, with no strings attached to Dennis Dawson or anyone else. Maggie found herself reaching for her coat. The drive to the county courthouse took 12 minutes through streets that were already turning white. Maggie parked her 1998 Ford F-150, a truck she had rebuilt from a salvage yard corpse 7 years ago, in a spot at the edge of the lot. The auction room on the second floor was nearly empty when she arrived. Just a handful of investors in expensive suits looking at their phones, clearly waiting for properties more valuable than Lot 47. A county clerk with a bored expression shuffled papers at a folding table, and a court recorder sat in the corner with a stenography machine that looked older than Maggie herself. The room smelled of dust and bureaucracy, the particular staleness of government buildings where hope came to be processed and filed away. The photos in the auction catalog showed a Victorian farmhouse in a state of profound neglect. 3 stories of peeling paint and broken windows, a wraparound porch that sagged at one corner like an old man's shoulder, a roof that was more gap than shingle. The listing noted that the property had been vacant since 1987, that previous auction attempts had failed due to lack of interest, that the structure required substantial renovation before it could be considered habitable. What the listing did not note, what no document mentioned, was the way the house in those photos seemed to be watching, the way those dark windows looked less like damage and more like eyes. Maggie studied the pictures while the auctioneer worked through lesser properties, her mechanic's eye picking out details that others might miss. The foundation looked solid even in photographs taken from unflattering angles. The ornate woodwork around the windows suggested craftsmanship that modern builders could not match. The bones of the house were good, she decided. Everything else was just surface damage, the kind of thing that patience and skill could fix. She had rebuilt engines that looked far worse. She had taken apart transmissions that seemed beyond salvation and returned them to perfect function. A house was just a bigger machine with different parts. When the auctioneer called Lot 47, the room fell silent. The Whitmore farmhouse, he announced, 4 acres of land, original structure, built 1892, condition as is with no warranty expressed or implied. Starting bid $15,000. Do I have $15,000? Nobody moved. The investors checked their phones or stared at the ceiling, making clear their disdain for a property that would cost more to rehabilitate than it could ever be worth on the open market. The auctioneer repeated his question, a note of desperation entering his voice. 12,000 then. Do I hear 12,000? Still nothing. The gavel was rising for the final time when Maggie raised her hand. $12,000, she said, and her voice did not shake. The sound of laughter rippled through the room, soft but unmistakable. A man in a charcoal suit leaned toward his companion and whispered something that made them both smirk. But Maggie kept her hand raised, her eyes fixed on the auctioneer, and after a long moment he nodded and brought down his gavel. Sold to the woman in the Carhartt jacket, he announced, and may God help her. As she approached the clerk's table to sign the paperwork, a man intercepted her path. He was perhaps 45 years old, with silver threading through dark hair that had been styled with expensive products, and he wore a cashmere overcoat that probably cost more than Maggie earned in a month. His smile was the kind that salesmen practiced in mirrors, wide and warm and completely empty behind the eyes. He introduced himself as Marcus Blackwell, owner of Blackwell Development, and explained that he had been watching the Whitmore property for some time. He was prepared to offer her double what she had just paid, right now in cash, before she even signed the deed. All she had to do was step aside and let him take the property off her hands. Maggie looked at him for a long moment, taking in the manicured nails and the silk tie and the confident posture of a man who had never been told no. She thought about the letter in her back pocket, about the $47,000 she could never pay, about the shop that would be gone in 60 days no matter what she did. $24,000 would not save her business, but it might buy a few more months, might give her time to find another solution. Then she thought about her children. About Ethan, 16 years old and disappearing into himself a little more each day, building walls so high that she could barely see him anymore. About Sophie, 12 years old and still believing that magic existed somewhere in the world, still drawing pictures of houses with gardens and swing sets and rooms for everyone. She thought about what it would mean to hand over this chance, this broken and imperfect chance, to a man whose smile never reached his eyes. The words left her mouth before she could reconsider. I appreciate the offer, Mr. Blackwell, but I do not sell things before I have had a chance to love them. She stepped around him and signed her name on the deed. The farmhouse was 15 miles outside of Bedford proper, down a county road that grew narrower and less maintained with every mile. The snow had intensified during the drive, falling in thick curtains that reduced visibility to a few hundred feet. Maggie gripped the steering wheel of the F-150 and leaned forward, squinting through the windshield at a landscape that was becoming increasingly unfamiliar. Her children sat beside her in tense silence, Ethan in the passenger seat with his arms crossed and his hood pulled up, Sophie in the back with her sketchbook clutched against her chest like armor against uncertainty. They had not taken the news well. Ethan had stared at her with the flat, disappointed expression he had perfected since his father left, the one that suggested he had expected her to fail and was merely waiting for the details. Sophie had cried, then rallied, then cried again, her 12-year-old emotions cycling through stages faster than Maggie could track. But they had both gotten into the truck when she asked, had both followed her into this adventure or disaster, had both proven that whatever else had broken in their family, the thread connecting them had not yet snapped. The farmhouse appeared through the snow like a ship emerging from fog. 3 stories of gray clapboard and black windows, a roof laden with white powder, a wraparound porch that seemed to sag with the weight of all the years it had stood empty. The windows on the upper floors were dark, but the lower ones had been boarded over, giving the facade a blind and somehow expectant quality. A massive oak tree stood in the front yard, its bare branches reaching toward the sky like fingers trying to grasp something just out of reach. The whole scene had the quality of a photograph from another era, a place where time had stopped and was only now beginning to move again. Maggie brought the truck to a stop in what had once been a circular driveway, but was now just a vague depression in the snow-covered ground. For a long moment, the 3 of them sat in silence, the only sound the ticking of the cooling engine and the soft hiss of snowflakes striking the windshield. Then Sophie spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "It is beautiful." Ethan made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been despair. "It is a death trap." But Maggie was not listening to either of them. She was looking at the house, really looking, the way she looked at an engine before she began to take it apart. She was seeing past the peeling paint and the broken shutters and the years of neglect, seeing the solid foundation and the elegant proportions and the craftsmanship that had gone into every detail. She was seeing possibility where others saw only ruin. She opened her door and stepped out into the snow. It came up past her ankles immediately, soaking through her work boots in seconds. The cold bit at her face and worked its way under her collar. Behind her, she heard the truck doors open as her children followed, drawn by curiosity or loyalty, or simply the lack of anywhere else to go. The front porch steps groaned under her weight but held. The front door was locked, but the lock was so old and corroded that it gave way with a single hard shove from her shoulder. The door swung inward, revealing a darkness that smelled of dust and old wood and something else, something harder to name. The scent of secrets kept too long. Maggie switched on the flashlight app on her phone and stepped inside. The entrance hall was larger than she had expected, with high ceilings that disappeared into shadow and a staircase that swept upward in an elegant curve. Dust lay thick on every surface, disturbed only by the tracks of small animals that had made their way in mud through gaps in the boards. A chandelier hung overhead, its crystals dulled by decades of grime but still catching the light from her phone in tiny sparks of brilliance. Portraits hung on the walls, their subjects obscured by dust and darkness, watching the newcomers with eyes that might have been painted or might have been something else entirely. The floorboards beneath her feet were solid despite the dust, made of oak that had aged to a deep honey color. Maggie tested each step before committing her weight, old habit from years of working on cars that could shift unexpectedly on their jacks. The wood complained but did not give. Good bones, she thought again. Good bones beneath all the neglect. She made her way through the first floor in a methodical survey, cataloging damage and noting repairs. The front parlor had water stains on the ceiling from a leak that had probably been fixed decades ago. The dining room still held a long table covered in sheets, with chairs arranged around it as if waiting for guests who would never arrive. The kitchen was a time capsule from the 1950s, with a massive cast-iron AGA stove that looked like it might still function, and a porcelain sink that was stained but intact. Everything was cold, cold enough that Maggie could see her breath, but the structure was sound and the potential was enormous. Sophie caught up with her in the kitchen doorway, eyes wide with wonder despite the grime and darkness. "Look at that stove," she breathed. "It is like something from a fairy tale." Ethan appeared behind his sister, his expression guarded but his eyes moving constantly, taking in details that he would never admit to noticing. "The wiring is going to be a nightmare," he said, "and the plumbing, and the roof, and probably the foundation too." Maggie turned to face her children, these two young people who had followed her into uncertainty without knowing why. She saw the fear they were both trying to hide, the doubt that had been planted 3 years ago when their father walked away and had been growing ever since. She saw children who had learned too young that security was an illusion and that the people who were supposed to protect them could disappear without warning. She reached out and placed a hand on each of their shoulders. "We are going to fix it," she said. "All of it. Together." Ethan looked away, but he did not pull back from her touch. Sophie leaned into her mother's side, seeking warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. The snow continued to fall outside the kitchen windows, covering the world in white, offering a chance to start over. Then Maggie noticed the door. It was at the back of the kitchen, half hidden behind a warped wooden frame that had swelled with moisture over the years. A pantry door, ordinary and unremarkable, except for the fact that it had been sealed shut with what looked like industrial adhesive around the edges. Someone had not wanted this door to be open. Someone had gone to significant effort to ensure that whatever was behind it would stay hidden. Maggie crossed the kitchen and examined the seal more closely. The adhesive was old, cracked, and yellowed with age, but it had been applied with care and precision. Not the work of a casual handyman, but of someone who had known exactly what they were doing and why. She pressed her palm against the door and felt resistance, not just from the adhesive, but from something else, a heaviness that seemed to push back against her touch. "There is something weirded about this door," she said, more to herself than to her children. Sophie came to stand beside her, head tilted, as she studied the sealed frame. Why would someone glue a pantry shut? Ethan hung back near the kitchen entrance, his posture tense. "Maybe there is a good reason. Maybe we should not open it." But Maggie was already reaching for the utility knife in her back pocket, the one she carried everywhere because a mechanic without a blade was a mechanic without options. She had spent her whole life being told what she should and should not do, what a woman could and could not accomplish, what dreams were realistic and which ones were foolish. She had lost her husband, her savings, and soon her shop to decisions made by other people. She was not going to let a little adhesive stop her from knowing what was in her own house. The blade cut through the old glue with surprising ease, releasing a smell of dust and something older. Something that reminded Maggie of her grandmother's attic, of boxes that had not been opened in generations. The door resisted for a moment when she pulled, the swollen wood grinding against the frame, and then it gave way with a sound like a sigh of relief. Behind the door was not a pantry. A narrow space, perhaps 4 feet deep and 8 feet wide, had been walled off from the rest of the kitchen. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper that might once have been cream-colored but had aged to the yellow of old bones. And on the back wall, beneath the paper that was flaking away in strips, Maggie could see something else. Wood. Dark wood carved with intricate patterns that caught the light from her phone in ways that made her head spin if she looked too long. She stepped into the space, her children forgotten behind her, drawn forward by a compulsion she could not name. Her hands reached out of their own accord and began to peel away the wallpaper, revealing more of the carved surface beneath. Spirals and circles, Celtic knots and geometric patterns, all of them flowing into each other with a precision that spoke of months or years of painstaking work. And at the center of the design, burned into the wood as if by a branding iron, a single word that seemed to pulse with its own faint light. Begin. Sophie appeared at her elbow, staring at the carving with an expression that was equal parts fear and fascination. "What does it mean?" Maggie shook her head, not trusting her voice. Her fingers continued to trace the patterns on the wood, feeling the grooves and ridges that someone had cut with such care so many years ago. The work was not merely decorative. The patterns formed shapes, boundaries, a design that became clearer the longer she looked at it. "It is a door," Ethan said from behind them, his voice flat with shock. "Look at the edges. Those are hinges." He was right. The carved panel was not just a wall, but a door built into the wall, disguised so cleverly that someone could have lived in this house for years without ever noticing it was there. The hinges were hidden within the carved patterns, visible only if you knew what to look for. And at the bottom right corner, partially obscured by a particularly complex spiral, there was a small round depression that might have been a keyhole or might have been something else entirely. That is when Sophie reached into her pocket and pulled out a coin. She had found it on the front porch when they first arrived, a disc of tarnished silver that had caught her eye amid the dust and debris. She had meant to show it to her mother, but had gotten distracted by everything else, and now it sat in her palm like a question waiting to be asked. "It is the same as the hole," she said, holding the coin up to compare. "Look." Maggie took the coin from her daughter's hand and examined it closely. It was old, far older than anything else in the house, with the image of an eagle on one side and a date that had been worn almost smooth. 1892, the same year the house had been built. She pressed the coin into the round depression. It fit perfectly, like a key finding its lock after a century of waiting. She turned it clockwise, and somewhere deep within the wall, a mechanism clicked. The hidden door swung open. Beyond it was darkness, absolute and complete, the kind of darkness that seemed to have weight and substance. Cold air rushed out of the opening, carrying the smell of earth and rust and something else, something that made the hair on the back of Maggie's neck stand up. A stairway descended into the black stone steps worn smooth by generations of feet that had walked this path before. Sophie's hand found Maggie's in the darkness and squeezed tight. Ethan moved closer, his shoulder brushing his mother's, the first voluntary contact he had initiated in months. The three of them stood at the threshold of something unknown, something that had been waiting in silence for nearly 100 years. "We should go down," Sophie whispered, her voice trembling with excitement rather than fear. "We have to know what is there." "This is insane," Ethan countered. "We do not know what is in there. Could be anything. Could be dangerous." Maggie looked at her children, these two young people who had followed her into an abandoned house in the middle of a snowstorm because she had asked them to. She thought about all the times she had played it safe, all the doors she had never opened, all the chances she had never taken because someone had told her the risk was too great. She thought about Dennis, who had taken everything and given nothing, who had made her believe that she was not enough. She thought about the letter in her pocket, the 60 days until foreclosure, the shop that would be gone no matter what she did. She was tired of being afraid. "Stay close to me," she said, and she started down the stairs. The stone steps were cold, even through her work boots, each one worn into a shallow curve by decades of use. Maggie counted them as she descended, a habit from childhood when she had counted stairs to distract herself from darkness she could not control. 17 steps, each one taking her deeper into the unknown, until her foot touched a floor of packed earth and she found herself standing in a space that had not seen light in generations. Her phone flashlight swept across the room, revealing details and fragments. A wooden desk, massive and ancient, its surface buried under decades of dust. Shelves along one wall holding books whose spines had rotted beyond recognition. A brass lamp on the desk, its glass chimney cracked but intact. And against the far wall, a massive iron trunk, its surface studded with brass rivets that still gleamed despite the years. Maggie crossed to the desk first, her footsteps raising small clouds of dust that swirled in the beam of her light. A single object sat on the desk's surface, less dusty than everything else, as if it had been placed there more recently. A book bound in red leather, its spine intact, its pages still crisp when she opened the cover. The handwriting inside was elegant, the kind of penmanship they used to teach in schools before computers made such things obsolete. The first entry was dated July 1928. "To whoever finds this," the entry began. "If you are reading these words, then perhaps you have found what others failed to see. This house holds more than wood and brick. It holds memory and warning. The world is changing. I fear collapse, not of the house, but of everything we have built. I have hidden what I could, not for greed, but for survival. Not everyone will understand that." Maggie turned the page and found a map. Not a map of the town or the county, but a map of the house itself, drawn in the same elegant hand. It showed rooms and hallways she had already seen, but it also showed others, spaces that had not appeared on any blueprint. passages that ran between walls and beneath floors. 3 underground chambers were marked with careful notation, one of them labeled the vault in capital letters. Her heart was pounding now, a rhythm she could feel in her temples and her wrists. She looked up from the journal and found Sophie standing at the iron trunk, her small hands resting on its lid. Ethan stood beside his sister, no longer hanging back, drawn into the mystery despite his better judgment. "Can I open it?" Sophie asked, her voice barely audible. Maggie nodded. The lid of the trunk rose with a groan of old metal, revealing contents that made all three of them catch their breath. Cloth bundles arranged in neat rows, each one wrapped in fabric that might once have been white but had aged to the color of weak tea. Sophie lifted the first bundle and unwrapped it with careful fingers, revealing a pocket watch made of gold, heavy and warm in her palm despite the cold of the cellar. Initials were engraved on the case, T to W. The second bundle held coins, not modern currency, but old gold pieces, double eagles and half eagles and denominations Maggie did not recognize. There were at least 30 of them, each one glinting in the flashlight beam like a small piece of captured sunlight. But it was the third bundle that stopped them all. Sophie unwrapped it to reveal not treasure but paper, a stack of letters tied together with blue ribbon that had faded almost to white. Each envelope was addressed in the same elegant hand. "For my daughter, Eleanor." Maggie took the letters gently, feeling the weight of decades in her hands. She slid one envelope open and began to read aloud, her voice strange in the silence of the cellar. "My dearest Eleanor, if you are reading this, then something has happened to me. Do not mourn, child. I have lived a life worth living, and I have loved you more than words can say. But there are things you must know, things I have kept hidden to protect you. The truth is buried beneath the garden floor. When the time comes, you will know where to look. Remember always that strength is not the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward despite it. Remember that you are my daughter, and you are stronger than you know." The letter was signed Harriet Whitmore, and the date was October 1928, just weeks before the stock market crash that had destroyed so many lives. Maggie looked at her children, at Sophie's tears and Ethan's clenched jaw, and she understood that they had found something far more valuable than gold. They had found a story, a thread connecting the past to the present, a woman who had hidden her treasures and her secrets in the hope that someday, someone worthy would find them. Then they heard the footsteps above, heavy treads crossing the kitchen floor, moving with purpose toward the pantry. The sound of something being dragged, furniture perhaps, blocking the exit. Then silence, a silence that was somehow worse than the footsteps because it meant that whoever was up there was now waiting, listening. Maggie switched off her flashlight and pulled her children close. In the absolute darkness of the cellar, she could feel Sophie trembling against her side, could feel Ethan's muscles coiled and ready despite his fear. Her own heart was pounding so hard she was certain it must be audible above. But she forced herself to breathe slowly, to think clearly, to plan. The footsteps resumed, moving away from the pantry now, crossing to another part of the house. A door slammed somewhere in the distance, then another. Whoever was up there was searching, but they did not know about the hidden stairway. They did not know that Maggie and her children were just a few feet below, hidden in a chamber that had kept its secrets for nearly a century. Minutes passed that felt like hours. The cold of the cellar seeped into Maggie's bones, making her muscles ache and her joints stiffen. But she did not move, did not make a sound, did not let go of her children until the footsteps above had faded and the silence had stretched long enough that she could be certain they were gone. When she finally switched her light back on, she saw her own fear reflected in her children's faces. But she also saw something else, a determination that had not been there before, a fierce protectiveness that made her think of a mother bear defending her cubs. "We need to get out of here," Ethan whispered. "Now." Maggie shook her head. She was thinking of the map in the journal, of the passages that ran between walls, of the other chambers that had been marked with careful notation. Whoever had been searching the house above would find the hidden door eventually. They would find the cellar and the trunk and the letters. Unless Maggie moved them first. "Help me," she said, and began to gather the contents of the trunk into her arms. They worked quickly and silently, wrapping the coins and the watch and the letters in their original bundles, stacking them into a pile that Sophie could carry. The journal Maggie tucked into the waistband of her jeans, pressed against her skin where she could feel its presence with every breath. The trunk they left behind, too heavy to move and too conspicuous to hide. The journey back up the stairs was worse than the descent. Every creak of the stone beneath their feet, a potential alarm. At the top, Maggie pressed her ear to the hidden door and listened. Silence. She eased the door open just enough to peer through, found the kitchen empty, and led her children out into the house that was suddenly more dangerous than it had been an hour ago. The front door was still open, letting in cold air and the fading gray light of late afternoon. Whoever had searched the house had come and gone, leaving no trace of their presence except the faint tracks of boots in the must and the lingering sense of violation that hung in the air like smoke. Maggie hustled her children out to the truck, checking the shadows for movement, scanning the tree line for figures. Nothing. The property was as empty as it had been when they arrived, but the emptiness felt different now, watched rather than abandoned. She started the engine and pulled away from the farmhouse, not breathing easily until they had reached the main road and the house had disappeared behind the veil of falling snow. That night, in their cramped apartment, with the heat turned low and the radiator clanking, Maggie spread the contents of the bundles across the kitchen table and examined them one by one. The coins were genuine, she was certain of that, old gold with the weight and patina that could not be faked. The watch was antique, probably worth thousands to the right collector. The letters numbered 17 in all, each one addressed to Eleanor Whitmore, each one containing fragments of a story that Maggie was only beginning to understand. But it was the journal that held her attention longest. She read through the entries one by one, following the thread of Harriet Whitmore's life through the pages. A widow who had inherited a fortune from her husband, a mother who had feared for her daughter's future, a woman who had seen disaster coming and had prepared as best she could, hiding her most precious possessions in places where they might survive whatever was to come. And in the final pages, a name that made Maggie's blood run cold. Reynolds. Harold Reynolds of the Reynolds Bank, who had been trying to take the Whitmore property through legal manipulation and forged documents, who had threatened Harriet with ruin if she did not sign over her home, who had been connected, according to the journal, to 3 mysterious deaths in the county that year. Maggie closed the journal and stared at the wall of their small kitchen, her mind racing through connections she did not want to make. First Indiana Trust had been called something else before, she remembered, back when her father had first taken out the mortgage on the shop. Something with Reynolds in the name. And Marcus Blackwell, the man with the cashmere coat and the empty smile, had been very interested in a property that should have been worthless. She did not believe in coincidences. Too many years of troubleshooting engine problems had taught her that when things failed, there was always a reason. The question was not whether the connections were real, but what they meant and what she was going to do about it. Sophie came into the kitchen in her pajamas, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "I had a bad dream," she said, "about the house, about someone chasing us." Maggie pulled her daughter onto her lap, holding her close the way she had when Sophie was small, and the world had seemed so much simpler. "It was just a dream," she said. "We are safe here." But even as she spoke the words, she knew they were not entirely true. They had found something that someone else wanted. They had opened a door that had been sealed for a reason. And tomorrow, when the sun rose over Bedford, they would have to decide what to do about it. Maggie looked at the treasures spread across her kitchen table, at the letters from a dead woman to a daughter who might never have received them, at the map of hidden chambers beneath a house that was now legally hers. She thought about the foreclosure notice in her pocket, about the 60 days she had left before she lost her father's shop, about the man in the cashmere coat who had offered to buy the farmhouse before she even signed the deed. She thought about running, packing up the coins and the watch, selling them to the highest bidder, using the money to pay off the bank and start over somewhere else. It would be the safe choice, the smart choice, the choice that a sensible person would make. But Maggie had never been particularly sensible. She had married a man everyone told her was wrong for her. She had kept a failing business alive through sheer stubbornness when everyone said she should sell. She had bought a ruined farmhouse in a snowstorm because something about it had called to her, had spoken to a part of herself that she had thought was dead. "We are going back," she said to Sophie, her voice quiet but certain. "We are going back to that house, and we are going to find out what else Harriet hid. And then we are going to make sure that whoever wants it never gets the chance to take it." Sophie looked up at her mother with eyes that were no longer sleepy. Her small hand found Maggie's and squeezed. "Together," she said. "All of us together." Maggie nodded and held her daughter close. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the town in white, offering the illusion of a fresh start. But beneath the surface, beneath the new snow and the frozen ground and the years of neglect, secrets waited to be discovered. And Maggie Dawson, auto mechanic and single mother and accidental treasure hunter, was just getting started. The next morning arrived gray and heavy, with fresh snow piled high against the windows and a bitter wind that rattled the glass in its frames. Maggie woke before dawn and lay in the darkness, listening to the sounds of her sleeping children and thinking about everything that had happened in the past 24 hours. The farmhouse, the hidden door, the cellar full of secrets, the footsteps of someone who had known exactly what they were looking for. She made coffee in the cramped kitchen, standing by the window and watching the sky lighten from black to charcoal to the pale gray of a winter morning. The treasures from the cellar were hidden now, wrapped in grocery bags and tucked into the back of her closet behind boxes of winter clothes. The journal she had kept with her through the night, reading and rereading the entries until she knew them almost by heart. Harriet Whitmore had been a woman ahead of her time, a widow in the 1920s with a young daughter and a fortune that men had been willing to kill for. She had fought to keep what was hers, had documented every threat and every suspicious incident, had built hidden chambers and secret doors because she had known that someday someone would come for what she had protected. And when the Great Depression hit in October 1929, when banks failed and fortunes disappeared overnight, she had already moved her most valuable possessions underground. What Maggie could not understand was why the treasures were still there. If Eleanor had inherited the property, why had she never claimed her mother's legacy? The letter suggested that Harriet had intended to tell her daughter about the hidden chambers, but the journal entries ended abruptly in November 1928, with no explanation for the silence that followed. The question gnawed at her as she made breakfast for her children, as she drove Ethan to his part-time job at the grocery store, as she dropped Sophie at her best friend's house for a previously scheduled playdate. The question was still with her when she found herself driving not toward the shop, but toward the county records office, where she spent 3 hours digging through property deeds and death certificates and newspaper archives that had been digitized with varying degrees of accuracy. What she found confirmed her worst suspicions and raised new questions she had not thought to ask. Harriet Whitmore had died in December 1928, just weeks after the last entry in her journal. The official cause of death was listed as pneumonia, but a newspaper article from the same period mentioned rumors of foul play that were never investigated. Eleanor Whitmore had been sent to live with relatives in Chicago, where she had remained until 1955, when she had returned to Bedford to sell the farmhouse that had belonged to her mother. The buyer had been Reynolds Bank. Maggie sat back in her chair, staring at the screen of the library's ancient computer. Reynolds Bank had owned the Whitmore property for 30 years before selling it to a private investor in 1985. That investor had died in a car accident 2 years later, and the property had reverted to the county for unpaid taxes. 3 attempts to auction it had failed, and then Maggie had walked into the courthouse and signed her name on a deed that connected her to a century of secrets and lies. She closed the browser and gathered her notes, her mind racing through possibilities. Marcus Blackwell had known about the property before she had. He had been watching it, waiting for someone to buy it so he could swoop in with his money and his connections and claim whatever Harriet Whitmore had hidden. But he had underestimated Maggie, had seen a woman in work clothes and assumed she would crumble at the first sign of opposition. He was going to learn otherwise. The drive back to the farmhouse took longer than before, the roads slick with ice beneath the fresh snow. Maggie drove carefully, her hands steady on the wheel, her mind running through the things she would need to do before the house was habitable. The furnace first, then the water pipes, then the windows that were letting in the cold. She had salvaged worse than this before. She had brought engines back from the dead. She could bring a house back too, if she had enough time and enough determination. The farmhouse emerged from the snow like an old friend, its broken features somehow less frightening now that she knew some of its secrets. Maggie parked in the same spot as the day before and sat for a moment, watching the windows for any sign of movement. Nothing. The house was as still as it had been when she had first arrived, waiting for her to decide what came next. She got out of the truck and walked toward the front porch, her boots crunching through the frozen crust of last night's snow. The front door was still unlocked from their hasty exit, swinging open at her touch to reveal the dusty entrance hall with its forgotten chandelier and its watchful portraits. She stepped inside and closed the door behind her, standing in the silence and letting the house settle around her like a coat she was trying on for size. "I am here," she said aloud, and her voice echoed through the empty rooms. "I am going to take care of you, and I am not going anywhere." The house did not answer, but Maggie could have sworn she felt something shift, some tension in the old walls easing just slightly. She smiled despite herself and headed for the kitchen, where the cast-iron stove waited to be coaxed back to life. She had work to do. The first week in the Whitmore farmhouse passed in a blur of frozen pipes and stubborn machinery. Maggie worked 18-hour days, her hands raw from cold and labor, her body aching in ways she had not experienced since the early years of building the shop. The cast-iron AGA stove proved more cooperative than expected, coming back to life after she cleared decades of soot from its flue and replaced a corroded gas valve with a part she had to drive 40 miles to find. By the third night, the kitchen was warm enough to sleep in, and by the fifth, the ancient boiler in the basement had begun pushing steam through radiators that groaned and clanked, but eventually delivered heat to the first floor. Ethan worked beside her without complaint, a transformation that startled Maggie more than any hidden door or buried treasure. The sullen teenager who had spent 3 years building walls around himself had begun to dismantle them, brick by brick, as they dismantled the decay that had accumulated in the old house. He learned to check pipe joints for corrosion, to test electrical outlets with a multimeter, to identify the difference between structural damage and cosmetic neglect. His questions came hesitantly at first, then with increasing confidence, and Maggie answered each one with the patience of a master craftsman passing knowledge to an apprentice. Sophie contributed in her own way, cataloging the contents of rooms they had not yet explored, sketching floor plans that matched and extended Harriet's hand-drawn map. She found treasures that had nothing to do with gold, photographs in tarnished frames showing a young woman who must have been Eleanor, letters tucked into books that had been left on shelves and forgotten, a child's doll with a porcelain face that had survived a century of neglect. Each discovery added another piece to the puzzle of the Whitmore family, another thread in the tapestry of lives that had unfolded within these walls. On the seventh day, Earl Hutchins appeared at the front door. Maggie had heard his name from the woman at the hardware store in town, an elderly man who lived on the adjacent property and who had been connected to the Whitmore place for longer than anyone could remember. She had expected someone frail and perhaps senile, the kind of neighbor who would peer through curtains and mutter about the old days. Instead, she found a man of 72 who moved with the deliberate economy of someone who had spent a lifetime working with his hands. His eyes were the pale blue of winter sky, sharp and assessing, and he carried a wooden crate that he set down on the porch without ceremony. "Tools," he said, his voice rough from years of cigarettes or cold air or both. "My grandfather's, then my father's, then mine. Swedish steel and white oak handles. No use to me anymore. Hands shake too much. But they deserve to be used by someone who knows their worth." Maggie looked at the crate, at the chisels and planes and saws nestled in oilcloth, at the care that had been taken to preserve them across generations. She thought about refusing, about pride and independence and not accepting charity, and then she thought about the work that still needed to be done and the tools she did not have. She invited Earl inside for coffee. The story emerged in fragments as they sat in the kitchen, the AGA stove radiating warmth, mugs of instant coffee steaming between them. Earl had been 23 years old in 1975 when the owner of the Whitmore property hired him to replace some flooring. He had found the hidden door behind the pantry wall, had descended the stone steps into the cellar, had seen the trunk and the books and the papers that had been waiting in darkness for nearly 50 years. "I told the owner," Earl said, his eyes fixed on some point beyond the kitchen window. "Man named Patterson, lawyer from Indianapolis. He went down there, came back up white as milk, told me to seal the door and forget I ever saw it, paid me double my fee, and made me sign something that said I would never speak of it. Week later, his car went off a bridge on Highway 37. They said it was ice, but there had not been ice on that road in a month." Maggie felt the cold that crept in despite the stove's warmth. "And the others? The other owners?" Earl shook his head slowly. Two more after Patterson. First one had a stroke within 6 weeks of moving in. Second one just disappeared one night, left everything behind, car still in the driveway. Nobody ever found him. After that, the property sat empty. Nobody wanted to touch it. People in town started saying it was cursed. Sophie had been listening from the doorway, her sketchbook forgotten in her hands. "It is not cursed," she said quietly. "It is protected. Harriet hid something important here, and she has been keeping it safe, waiting for the right person to find it." Earl turned to look at the girl, and something shifted in his weathered face. "You might be right, young lady. You might be right at that." He returned his attention to Maggie. "The question is whether you are the right person, and whether you are ready for what comes next." "What comes next?" Earl reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a folded newspaper clipping, yellowed with age. He spread it on the table, revealing a photograph of a woman in early 20th century dress standing in front of the very house where they now sat. The caption read, "Mrs. Harriet Whitmore, widow of industrialist Thomas Whitmore, at her Bedford residence, October 1928. "She was beautiful," Sophie whispered. "She was brave," Earl corrected. "Braver than anyone knew. My grandmother worked for her in the last year of her life. Said Harriet knew something terrible was coming, not just the stock market crash, but something worse. Said she spent those final months preparing, hiding things, building secret rooms and passages that nobody else knew about. And she said Harriet was afraid, not for herself, but for her daughter. There were men who wanted what she had, men who would do anything to get it." Maggie thought of Marcus Blackwell in his cashmere coat, his offer to buy the property before she even signed the deed. "The Reynolds family?" Earl nodded. "Harold Reynolds ran the biggest bank in the county back then. When the crash came, he was one of the few who came out ahead because he had inside information, or so people said. The Reynolds family built an empire on the backs of people who lost everything in the Depression, and they have been trying to get their hands on the Whitmore property ever since, because of what Harriet hid, because of what Harriet knew." Earl leaned forward, his voice dropping. "My grandmother told me something else, something she made me swear never to repeat. She said Harriet had proof that Harold Reynolds murdered her husband. Thomas Whitmore did not die of a heart attack. He was poisoned, and Harriet had the evidence, but could not go to the authorities because Reynolds had bought them all. So she hid it, along with everything else, and she waited for the right moment to bring him down. And that moment never came." Earl shook his head. "She died before she could use it. And Eleanor never knew where to look. She grew up in Chicago with relatives, came back once in 1955 to sell the property, and never set foot in Indiana again. Reynolds Bank bought the house and sat on it for 30 years, tearing apart walls and digging up floors, looking for what Harriet had hidden. They never found it. The journal entries came back to Maggie, the careful documentation of threats and suspicious incidents, the growing fear that had threaded through the final pages. Harriet had been fighting a secret war against men with money and power and no conscience. She had been losing that war, and she had known it, so she had done the only thing she could. She had hidden the weapons and waited for a soldier who had not yet been born. Maggie looked at the photograph of the woman who had stood in this kitchen nearly a century ago, who had looked out these same windows at these same fields. She thought about the letters addressed to Eleanor, about the mother's love that had been preserved in ink and paper, about the daughter who had never received them. "I'm going to finish what she started," Maggie said, and her voice did not waver. Earl studied her for a long moment, those pale eyes seeing something that others missed. "I believe you might," he said finally. "I believe you just might." The next morning brought fresh challenges in the form of a county inspector named Wilson, a thin man with a clipboard and a pinched expression, who informed Maggie that a complaint had been filed regarding unsafe living conditions. He spent 3 hours cataloging violations, from the antiquated electrical system to the lack of proper egress windows in the bedrooms. And when he left, he handed her a document listing 17 items that needed to be addressed within 14 days, or the property would be condemned. Maggie stood on the front porch watching his county car disappear down the driveway, the document crumpling in her fist. She did not need to ask who had filed the complaint. Marcus Blackwell had made his first move, and it was exactly the kind of move she should have expected. Legal, deniable, and devastating. 17 items in 14 days. rewiring the entire house, installing egress windows, replacing the stair railings, updating the plumbing. Any one of those tasks would take a professional crew a week. Together they were impossible, a death sentence delivered with bureaucratic precision. Ethan appeared beside her, having watched the inspection from the kitchen doorway. We can not do all of that. Not in 2 weeks, not even close. Maggie unfolded the document and read through the items again, her mechanic's mind breaking each task into its component parts. Some of the violations were genuine safety concerns that she had already planned to address. Others were borderline, the kind of things that a sympathetic inspector might overlook. And a few were clearly manufactured, problems that did not exist or had been exaggerated beyond recognition. We do not have to do all of it, she said slowly. We just have to do enough to pass reinspection. And we have to do it before Blackwell realizes what we are up to. What are we up to? Maggie smiled, the first genuine smile she had managed since the inspector arrived. We are going to play his game better than he plays it. And we are going to find what Harriet hid before he has a chance to take this house away from us. The days that followed were a blur of frantic activity. Maggie called in every favor she had accumulated over 18 years of fixing cars for people who could not always pay, and one by one they came. Jimmy Chen, whose transmission she had rebuilt for cost when his wife was sick. Maria Gonzalez, whose son's car she had kept running through 4 years of college. Old Frank Morrison, who had worked with her father and still remembered the day Maggie had changed her first oil filter at age 11. They came with tools and expertise and the quiet determination of people repaying debts they had never forgotten. The electrical work fell to Jimmy, a licensed electrician who had retired but still knew his way around a circuit box. The plumbing went to Maria's brother Carlos, who had learned the trade in the Army and had never lost the skill. Frank took on the carpentry, his arthritic hands steadier than they had been in years as he measured and cut and fitted new railings to the old staircase. Maggie coordinated the effort like a general directing a campaign, moving from room to room, solving problems as they arose, keeping the work on schedule despite setbacks that would have stopped a lesser team. The furnace died on day 3 and had to be coaxed back to life with a part cannibalized from an old water heater. A pipe burst on day 5, flooding the first floor hallway until Carlos managed to shut off the water main. On day 7, a section of ceiling collapsed in the upstairs bathroom, revealing rot that had to be cut away and replaced before the inspector would approve. Through it all, Maggie kept working on the other problem, the one that could not be solved with wrenches and wire. Every night after the volunteers had gone home and her children were asleep, she spread Harriet's journal and map across the kitchen table and studied them by lamplight. The map showed 3 underground chambers, but they had only found one. The other 2 were marked in areas that did not correspond to any obvious features of the house or grounds. The garden, Sophie had said, pointing to the 3rd chamber on the map. The one Harriet called the vault. It is under the garden, but the garden was buried under 2 feet of frozen snow, and the ground beneath was solid as concrete. Maggie had tried digging on the first night and had given up after breaking 2 shovel handles against the impenetrable earth. Whatever was buried there would have to wait until spring unless she found another way in. The answer came on day 9 in the form of another letter tucked into a book that Sophie had pulled from the library shelves. This one was different from the others, written not in Harriet's elegant hand, but in a childish scrawl that had to belong to a young Eleanor. Dear Mama, I found the secret way to your special room today. You said I was not supposed to go there, but I wanted to see what you were hiding. I promise I did not touch anything. I just looked. The tunnel from the root cellar is very long and very dark, but I was not scared. Love, your brave girl. Maggie read the letter 3 times before its meaning sank in. A tunnel from the root cellar, another entrance to the vault, one that did not require digging through frozen ground. She looked at the map again with new eyes and saw what she had missed before. A faint dotted line running from a structure labeled RC to the chamber marked vault. The root cellar was a separate building, a low mound of earth at the edge of the property that she had assumed was just a storage shed or perhaps a collapsed outbuilding. She had never examined it closely, had never thought to look for anything beyond what was obvious. She did not wait for morning. The root cellar door was frozen shut, but it yielded to a crowbar and determination. Inside, the air was colder than outside, a penetrating chill that cut through her heaviest coat. Her flashlight revealed shelves lined with empty mason jars, hooks where hams and sausages had once hung, and at the back, partially hidden behind a collapsed shelf unit, a wooden door set into the earthen wall. The door opened onto darkness, a narrow passage that sloped downward into the earth. Maggie hesitated for a moment, thinking about Patterson and the man who had disappeared, about the warning in Earl's voice when he spoke of the house and its secrets. Then she thought about the foreclosure notice that had started all of this, about the life she was trying to build for her children, about the woman who had carved begin into a hidden door and had trusted that someday, someone would be brave enough to open it. She stepped into the tunnel. The passage was longer than she expected, the walls reinforced with wooden beams that had survived a century of pressure from the earth above. Her footsteps echoed strangely, multiplied by the confined space until it sounded like an army was marching beside her. The air grew warmer as she descended, and after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the tunnel opened into a chamber that stole her breath. The vault was larger than the first cellar, a room perhaps 20 feet square, with a ceiling high enough that she could not touch it even with her arm fully extended. The walls were lined with shelves, and the shelves were filled with boxes and trunks and wrapped bundles that had been waiting in the darkness for nearly 100 years. A desk sat in the center of the room, and on that desk, illuminated by her flashlight beam, was a strong box made of iron with a lock that had rusted but still held. Maggie moved through the vault in a daze, touching objects that had not been touched since Harriet Whitmore had placed them here. Silver candlesticks blackened by time, china plates wrapped in cloth that crumbled at her touch, bundles of currency that might have been worthless or might have been priceless. And in a trunk against the far wall, documents, hundreds of pages of documents, bound with ribbon and sealed with wax. She took the strong box and the documents, leaving everything else where it lay. There would be time later to inventory the full contents of the vault. For now, she needed to understand what Harriet had been protecting and why someone was willing to kill to get it. The documents told a story that was worse than Maggie had imagined. Harold Reynolds had not just murdered Thomas Whitmore. He had been running a criminal enterprise for years, bribing officials, forging deeds, systematically stealing land from farmers who did not understand the contracts they were signing. Thomas Whitmore had discovered the scheme and had been preparing to expose it when he died of what the doctors called heart failure. But what Harriet's documents revealed was arsenic poisoning. The evidence was meticulous and damning. Sworn statements from servants who had witnessed Reynolds meeting with Thomas Whitmore on the day of his death. Chemical analysis of samples that Harriet had somehow preserved. Letters between Reynolds and his conspirators discussing how to silence the widow before she could make trouble. And at the bottom of the stack, a single page that made Maggie's hands shake as she read it. A list of properties that Reynolds had stolen over the years and the families he had destroyed to get them. One of those names was familiar. Dawson. Her father's family had been on that list. Her grandfather had lost his farm to Reynolds Bank in 1931, had been forced to move to town and find work as a laborer, had died of a broken heart within 5 years. The poverty that had shaped her father's childhood, the struggle that had defined his adult life, the legacy of hardship that had been passed down to Maggie herself, all of it could be traced back to Harold Reynolds and the empire he had built on stolen land and murdered men. The strong box required a key she did not have, but the lock was so rusted that it gave way after a few minutes of work with a hammer and chisel. Inside, she found what Harriet had considered most precious, not gold or jewels, but photographs of Eleanor at every age, locks of her daughter's hair tied with ribbon, a tiny dress that must have been worn on a special occasion. And beneath these treasures, a sealed envelope addressed simply, "For the one who finishes what I started." Maggie opened the envelope with trembling fingers. "My dear friend," the letter began, "I do not know your name or when you will read this, but I know that you exist. I have seen you in my dreams, a woman with strong hands and a stronger heart, a mother who will do anything to protect her children. I have left you everything I could not trust to lawyers or banks or the justice of men. The evidence you hold can destroy the Reynolds family and everyone who has profited from their crimes. Use it wisely, use it when the time is right, and know that across the span of years, I am grateful for your courage." The letter was signed Harriet Whitmore and dated November 1928, 3 weeks before her death. Maggie sat in the vault surrounded by a dead woman's treasures and wept for the first time since Dennis had left. She wept for Harriet, who had died alone and afraid. She wept for Eleanor, who had never known what her mother had sacrificed. She wept for her grandfather and father, whose lives had been shaped by crimes they never knew had been committed. And she wept for herself, for the woman who had thought she was buying a rundown farmhouse and had instead inherited a century of secrets and pain. When the tears were spent, she gathered the documents and the letter and made her way back through the tunnel to the world above. The snow was still falling when she emerged from the root cellar, but it felt different now, cleaner somehow, as if the act of discovery had changed the very air she breathed. She knew what she had to do. The evidence in her hands could bring down Marcus Blackwell and everyone connected to the Reynolds legacy, but using it would mean exposing herself and her children to danger, would mean fighting an enemy with money and power and no conscience. It would mean becoming the kind of person Harriet had been, brave and determined and willing to risk everything for justice. The choice should have been difficult. It was not. The county inspector returned on day 14, clipboard in hand, pinched expression firmly in place. Maggie walked him through the house room by room, showing him the work that had been completed, the improvements that had been made, the safety concerns that had been addressed. She watched his face grow increasingly frustrated as he checked items off his list, unable to find the violations he had clearly been sent to confirm. In the end, he approved 14 of the 17 items and gave her an extension of 30 days to complete the remaining 3. It was not a victory, not yet, but it was enough to keep the house from being condemned. Blackwell's next move came 2 days later, in the form of a black SUV that rolled up the driveway just as the sun was setting. Maggie watched from the kitchen window as he stepped out, his cashmere coat exchanged for something heavier and more practical, his polished shoes replaced by boots that actually belonged on a working farm. He was adapting, learning, becoming a more dangerous opponent. She met him on the front porch, Ethan standing just inside the door where Blackwell could see him but could not reach him. The temperature had dropped as the sun went down, and their breath fogged in the air between them. Ms. Dawson, Blackwell's smile was the same as it had been at the auction, warm and wide and completely false. I see you have been busy. Quite the transformation you have managed in just 2 weeks. Maggie did not return the smile. What do you want? The same thing I wanted the day we met. This property. I am prepared to increase my offer to $7 million, wired to your account within 24 hours of signing. Think about what that money could do for your family. A new start, college for your children, freedom from the debts that I understand are weighing rather heavily on your current situation. The mention of her debts was not subtle. Blackwell wanted her to know that he had done his research, that he knew about the foreclosure notice and the failing shop and the precarious financial situation that had brought her to the county auction in the first place. It was meant to intimidate, to remind her of how vulnerable she was. It had the opposite effect. Maggie stepped closer to him, close enough to see the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. You think you know everything about me, don't you? You think you have me all figured out. Poor single mother, desperate for money, willing to sell her soul for the right price. She shook her head slowly. You do not know anything. You do not know what I found in this house. You do not know what Harriet Whitmore left behind, and you do not know what I am going to do with it. Blackwell's smile faltered for just a moment before he recovered. I am sure I do not know what you are talking about. Then let me make it clear. Maggie's voice was steady, cold as the winter air around them. I know about Harold Reynolds. I know about Thomas Whitmore. I know about the land your family stole and the people they destroyed, including mine. I have the evidence, all of it, everything Harriet spent the last year of her life gathering. And if you come near this house or my family again, I will make sure every newspaper in the state knows exactly how the Blackwell fortune was built. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the wind and the distant sound of a car on the highway. Blackwell's face had gone pale beneath his careful tan, and for the first time Maggie saw fear in his eyes. You are making a terrible mistake, he said finally. You have no idea who you are dealing with. I know exactly who I am dealing with. Maggie turned her back on him and walked toward the door. And I am not afraid. She was inside the house with the door locked behind her before he reached his car. Through the window, she watched the SUV's taillights disappear into the darkness, and she allowed herself a small smile of satisfaction. The war had begun, but she had just won the first battle. The week after Maggie's confrontation with Blackwell brought a silence that felt less like peace and more like the held breath before a storm. She used the time to organize the evidence from the vault, creating copies of every document, photographing every page, storing backups in 3 separate locations. Earl helped her identify a lawyer in Indianapolis who had made his reputation taking on cases against powerful interests, a man named Samuel Reeves, whose grandfather had lost his own farm to Reynolds Bank in 1932. The connection was not coincidental. Harriet's documents had listed the Reeves family among the victims, and Samuel had spent his entire career trying to prove what Maggie could now demonstrate with a single stack of yellowed papers. The meeting with Reeves took place in a coffee shop halfway between Bedford and Indianapolis, neutral ground where they could speak without being overheard by anyone connected to Blackwell's network. Maggie spread the key documents across the table, watching as the lawyer's expression shifted from professional skepticism to something closer to awe. He read through the evidence twice, asking questions that showed he understood exactly what he was looking at and exactly what it meant. "This changes everything," he said finally. "Not just for your case, but for dozens of families who lost everything to Reynolds Bank and its successors. If we can authenticate these documents, we can prove a pattern of criminal behavior spanning nearly a century: fraud, forgery, conspiracy to commit murder. The statute of limitations on most of these crimes expired decades ago, but the civil implications are enormous. We are talking about potential claims in the hundreds of millions of dollars." Maggie had not thought about money, not really. Her goal had been simpler, more personal, to protect her family and honor the woman who had hidden these secrets so long ago. But the lawyer's words opened new possibilities, avenues of justice that Harriet could never have imagined. What happens now? Reeves gathered the documents carefully, treating them with the reverence they deserved. "Now we build a case. I will need to bring in forensic experts to authenticate the papers, historians to provide context, investigators to trace the chain of custody from Harriet to the present day. This will take months, possibly years. And during that time, Blackwell will do everything in his power to stop us." "I can handle Blackwell." The lawyer looked at her with eyes that had seen too many clients underestimate their opponents. "Can you? He has money, connections, and a family legacy of making problems disappear. The people who tried to expose Reynolds in the past ended up dead or disappeared. What makes you think you will be different?" Maggie thought about the farmhouse waiting for her in Bedford, about her children who had finally started to believe that something good could come from all their suffering. She thought about Harriet Whitmore, who had faced the same enemy with far fewer resources and had managed to preserve the truth for nearly 100 years. "Because I am not trying to hide," she said. "I am trying to fight. And I have something Harriet never had." "What is that?" "Nothing left to lose." The drive back to Bedford took 2 hours through a landscape that was slowly emerging from winter's grip. The snow had begun to melt in the fields, revealing brown earth that would soon turn green with new growth. Maggie watched the transformation through the windshield and felt something similar happening inside herself, a thawing of fears and doubts that had frozen her for too long. The farmhouse appeared around the final bend, and she felt the now familiar surge of recognition that came every time she saw it. The repairs of the past weeks had made a visible difference. Fresh paint covered the worst of the weathered siding. New glass gleamed in windows that had been dark for decades. The porch no longer sagged, its supports replaced and reinforced by Frank's careful carpentry. The house looked less like something abandoned and more like something waiting to be lived in. Ethan met her at the door with news that made her heart stop. Sophie had found something in the attic, something hidden behind a false wall that none of them had noticed before. She was still up there, refusing to come down until her mother saw what she had discovered. The attic stairs creaked as Maggie climbed them, each step carrying her higher into the house's final secrets. The space at the top was larger than she had expected, running the full length of the building under rafters that had been hand-hewn from local timber. Dust motes danced in the light from a single dormer window, and the air smelled of old wood and forgotten things. Sophie sat in the far corner, surrounded by boxes that had been pulled from behind a section of wall that now stood open like a wound. Her face was streaked with dust and tears, and in her hand she held a photograph that she extended toward her mother without speaking. The image showed two women standing in front of the farmhouse, arms around each other's waists, smiling at the camera with the easy affection of close friends. One of them was clearly Harriet Whitmore, recognizable from the newspaper clipping Earl had shown them. The other was younger, darker-haired, with features that seemed somehow familiar, despite the sepia tones and century of distance. Maggie turned the photograph over and read the inscription on the back. Harriet and Margaret, summer 1927. Sisters not by blood, but by choice. Margaret. She looked at her daughter at the name they shared with a woman who had lived and died before either of them was born. The coincidence was too precise to be random, too loaded with meaning to be dismissed. Someone or something had guided Maggie to this house, to this moment, to this discovery. Whether it was fate or chance, or the echo of a friendship that had transcended death, she could not say. The boxes Sophie had uncovered contained more photographs, more letters, more pieces of a story that was only now becoming clear. Margaret Whitmore had not been a relative, but a companion, a woman who had come to work as Harriet's secretary in 1925 and had become her closest confidant. The letters between them spoke of plans and preparations, of evidence being gathered and hidden, of a network of allies who had promised to protect the truth if anything happened to either of them. One letter, dated October 1928, contained a passage that made Maggie's breath catch. "My dearest Margaret," Harriet had written, "if the worst should happen, I know you will carry on our work. The evidence is hidden where only you know to look, in the places we discussed during our long nights of planning. Promise me that you will not give up, that you will find a way to bring justice even if it takes 100 years. Promise me that someday someone will know the truth." The letter was unsigned, interrupted perhaps by the illness that would take Harriet's life within weeks, but the promise it asked for had been kept. Margaret, whoever she was, had preserved these boxes and hidden them where they would be safe. And now, nearly a century later, another Margaret had found them. Maggie sat in the attic, surrounded by the relics of a friendship that had shaped history, and felt the weight of responsibility settle onto her shoulders. Harriet had asked for a promise, and Margaret had kept it. Now the task had passed to a new generation, to a woman who bore the same name and faced the same enemy and had the same choice to make. She made it without hesitation. The first newspaper story ran 3 weeks later, a front-page expose in the Indianapolis Star that detailed the crimes of the Reynolds family and their modern-day inheritors. Samuel Reeves had orchestrated the release carefully, timing it to coincide with the authentication of key documents by forensic experts and the filing of a massive civil lawsuit on behalf of 17 families whose ancestors had been defrauded. The story named Marcus Blackwell as the current beneficiary of stolen wealth and demanded a full accounting of the Reynolds fortune. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Television crews descended on Bedford, setting up cameras outside the farmhouse that had kept its secrets for so long. Reporters called day and night, requesting interviews that Maggie declined. Politicians who had accepted donations from Blackwell scrambled to return the money and distance themselves from the scandal. Banks that had done business with his development company began quietly terminating their relationships. Blackwell himself disappeared from public view, his social media accounts deleted, his office phones unanswered. Rumors circulated that he had fled to a country without extradition treaties, that he had been seen at a private airport boarding a chartered jet, that he had suffered some kind of breakdown and was being treated at an exclusive facility in Arizona. The truth, when it emerged, was both simpler and more satisfying. Federal marshals arrested Marcus Blackwell at his Indianapolis penthouse on a Tuesday morning, charging him with fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. The evidence Harriet had gathered had opened doors that led to modern crimes, financial irregularities that Blackwell had assumed would never be discovered, bribes paid to officials who were now cooperating with prosecutors in exchange for reduced sentences. The empire built on stolen land was crumbling, and the man who had inherited it was facing the prospect of spending the rest of his life in prison. Maggie watched the news coverage from the living room of the farmhouse, her children on either side of her, Earl Hutchins in the armchair by the fire. The reporter on screen was standing in front of the very building where they sat, describing how a single mother from Bedford, Ford had exposed one of the longest-running criminal conspiracies in Indiana history. Sophie squeezed her mother's hand. "You did it. You actually did it. We did it," Maggie corrected. "All of us together. And Harriet, she started this fight 100 years ago. We just finished it." Earl raised his coffee mug in a silent toast, his weathered face showing something that might have been a smile. "She would have liked you," he said. "Harriet, she would have been proud." The spring that followed was the busiest of Maggie's life. The civil lawsuit proceeded through the courts, with settlements beginning to trickle in to the families who had waited generations for justice. The farmhouse required endless work, each repair revealing new problems that demanded attention. And the volunteers who had helped save the property from condemnation kept returning, drawn by something they could not name, a sense that the old house had become a symbol of something larger than any of them. Maggie paid off the debt on her shop with money from the first settlement check, then sold the business to Jimmy Chen for $1 and the promise that he would keep her father's name on the sign. She did not need the shop anymore, not now that she had found her true purpose. The farmhouse was her workshop now, her restoration project, her legacy to the future. Ethan graduated from high school in June with honors, his college applications bolstered by an essay about discovery and justice that had made the admissions officers at Purdue weep. He had changed in the months since they had moved to the farmhouse, the anger that had defined him replaced by something more constructive. He talked about studying architecture, about learning to preserve old buildings the way his mother had preserved this one. He talked about the future with hope instead of dread. Sophie spent the summer cataloging the contents of the vault and the attic, working with historians from Indiana University to create an archive of the Whitmore legacy. Her drawings of the house and its secrets became illustrations for a book that one of the professors was writing, and her name would appear in the acknowledgments alongside scholars 3 times her age. She had found her calling in the space between past and present, in the stories that old houses whispered to those who knew how to listen. The first anniversary of the purchase arrived on a December morning that was cold but clear, the fields covered in fresh snow that glittered in the early light. Maggie stood on the front porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sun rise over the land that had been fought over and stolen and recovered across 5 generations. The house stood solid behind her, its wounds healed, its secrets revealed, its purpose fulfilled. Earl arrived at noon with a sapling wrapped in burlap, a cherry tree that he had started from a cutting taken from Harriet's original orchard. Together, they planted it near the entrance to the root cellar, in the spot where Margaret's journal had described a garden that Harriet had loved. Sophie read passages from the letters while Ethan shoveled earth around the roots. And when they were finished, they stood in a circle around the small tree and said nothing at all because nothing needed to be said. The gathering that evening was larger than Maggie had expected. The volunteers who had helped repair the house came with their families. The descendants of other victims came with their stories. Samuel Reeves came with documents announcing that the final settlement had been reached, that every family on Harriet's list would receive compensation for what had been stolen. Earl came with a bottle of bourbon that had been aging in his basement since 1962, waiting for an occasion worthy of opening it. They filled the rooms of the farmhouse with laughter and conversation, with children running through hallways that had been silent for decades, with the warmth of community that had been Harriet's vision all along. Maggie moved through the crowd, accepting congratulations and gratitude that she deflected toward others, toward the volunteers and the lawyers and the historians who had made justice possible. Late in the evening, when most of the guests had departed and only family remained, Maggie climbed the attic stairs one final time. The boxes were gone now, transferred to the university archive where they would be preserved and studied for generations. The false wall had been repaired, the secrets it had protected finally free to be known. The space was empty except for moonlight streaming through the dormer window, painting silver rectangles on the dusty floor. She sat in the spot where Sophie had found the photograph, looking out at the snow-covered fields that stretched to the horizon. The weight she had carried since Dennis left, since the foreclosure notice arrived, since she had first stepped through the front door of a house that had chosen her as surely as she had chosen it, that weight was gone now, replaced by something lighter and more durable. A legacy was not something you inherited. It was something you built, one choice at a time, one act of courage following another until you had created something that would outlast your own brief presence in the world. Harriet had understood that truth and had passed it down through hidden chambers and coded messages, waiting for someone who would understand. Maggie understood. Footsteps on the stairs announced Sophie's arrival. The girl settled beside her mother without speaking, two figures framed by moonlight, surrounded by the house that had brought them together. "Do you think she knows?" Sophie asked finally. Harriet. "Do you think she knows what we did?" Maggie considered the question, thought about dreams and coincidences and the strange certainty she had felt from the moment she first saw this house in a photograph. "I think she knew before we did. I think she has been waiting for us all along." Sophie nodded, accepting this as children accept truths that adults would question. "What happens now we live?" Maggie put her arm around her daughter's shoulders. "We take care of this house and it takes care of us. We tell Harriet's story and our own, and we make sure no one forgets what happened here. We build something worth leaving behind." They sat together as the moon traversed the sky, as the house settled around them with creaks and sighs that sounded almost like contentment. Below them, Ethan and Earl were cleaning up from the party, their voices drifting up through the floors, the sound of family forming from the fragments of loss and discovery. The farmhouse had stood for more than a century, witnessing births and deaths, secrets and revelations, crimes and justice. It had been abandoned and forgotten, condemned and reborn. It had waited in silence for the right person to find it, to hear its stories, to continue the work that Harriet had begun. Maggie Dawson, auto mechanic and single mother and accidental historian, had answered that call. She had opened a door that was not on any blueprint and had found not just treasure, but truth. She had faced an enemy with money and power and had won through courage and persistence and the accumulated weight of justice deferred. And now, in the quiet aftermath of victory, she understood what Harriet had known all those years ago, what Margaret had preserved, what the house itself had been trying to tell her from the very first moment. Some doors are hidden because the world is not ready for what lies behind them. Some secrets are kept because the right person has not yet been born. Some houses wait because they know that someday someone will come who is strong enough to bear their burdens and brave enough to share their stories. Maggie had been that person. Her children would carry the work forward, and the farmhouse, no longer abandoned, no longer forgotten, would stand as a monument to everyone who had ever been told they were too broken to begin again. The end was not really an end, it was a beginning, as all true endings are. A foundation laid for futures not yet imagined, for stories not yet told, for justice not yet achieved. Harriet Whitmore had started something in 1928 that Maggie Dawson had finished in the present, but the chain would continue, link by link, generation by generation, as long as there were people willing to open hidden doors and face whatever waited on the other side. The snow continued to fall outside the attic window, covering the world in white, offering the illusion of a fresh start. But Maggie knew now that fresh starts were not illusions. They were choices made again and again every day by people who refused to let the past determine the future. She had made that choice when she raised her hand at the auction. She had made it again when she confronted Blackwell on the porch. She had made it every time she picked up a tool or opened a document or told her children that they would get through this together. And she would keep making it every morning when she woke in the house that had chosen her, every evening when she watched the sunset over fields that were finally free of the crimes committed upon them. She would make that choice until it became habit, until it became instinct, until it became legacy. The cherry tree they had planted that morning would grow tall in the years to come. Its branches would spread across the garden where Harriet had walked with Margaret nearly a century ago. Its blossoms would fall like snow in spring, covering the ground with pink and white, marking time's passage in the only language that mattered. And beneath its shade, future generations would gather to hear the story of a house that kept secrets, a woman who hid them, and another woman who brought them into the light. The story was finished. The house was home. And Margaret Dawson, who had started the year with grease under her fingernails and a knot of worry in her stomach, ended it with something far more valuable than gold or property or victory over enemies. She ended it with family, with purpose, with a certain knowledge that some things, once found, could never be taken away. The farmhouse seemed to sigh around her, settling into its foundations with the contentment of a task completed. Outside, the moon continued its journey across the sky, indifferent to human drama, eternal witness to all the stories that unfolded beneath its silver light. Maggie closed her eyes and let the silence wrap around her like a blanket. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new choices, new opportunities to build the life she had never dared to dream. But tonight, in this moment, everything was exactly as it should be. She was home.